Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 788, January the 12th, 1987. If you want information on how to obtain back broadcasts or how to subscribe to regular broadcasts that are mailed out with the bibliography sheet that accompanies it, you can write to me, M-A-E, it is Brussels, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922. For those of you who listen off the air and do not subscribe to the tapes through the mail, I may discontinue the bibliography sheets unless you show some kind of activism in a way that you're using them. I'm tired of stuffing envelopes to know that they go somewhere in a drawer and are not used for purposes for which they're intended. I would like to see you write to members of Congress, to investigating committees, letters to the editor, and call talk shows that are in the major cities. Most of the cities have all-day talk shows, the larger ones. And I think that you should be using the information in some way. Otherwise, I'm not sure that I want to spend my time that could be used in other ways just filling envelopes with bibliography sheets. Now, in Monterey County, we're having trouble again with frost ban with Advanced Genetic Sciences. The firm wants to have a new testing out here in Hollister. They've planned that, and they're seeking permission, not permission, but they've announced that frost ban will be sprayed. Last year it was stopped until March of 1987, and they're ready to come back with that live genetic altered bacteria for the first time in this area. It would be tested here. They've been using it in other places, actually around the country. And up at Tule Lake, they have the projects called Ice Minus, and the people up there are objecting to putting this frost ban on potato plants. They're told that there's no problem to plant or animal life, and people don't want to be guinea pigs in the case. Contra Costa County in California, whoever's speaking for them, one particular man, Elgin Martin, has 110 acres of pears, and he said this past week he's not afraid of bacteria tests, that they can do it in Contra Costa County. But just about the same time that he said that, one day earlier, there was an article on cancer rate up in 5 Bay Area counties, and the lung cancer was the worst in Contra Costa County. And I predicted years ago that they would probably be target for cancer experiments and possibly from food that was handed down at the time of the SLA program. And I don't think it's just coincidental. I know the air is bad and all that, but Contra Costa County is one of the worst. It is the worst in the northern area for lung cancer. And a spokesman is saying, come on, bring on AGS. Let's try our luck one more time. Before I get on to CONTRAGATE, I want to just mention several disturbing articles that can't be ignored. One is called Trouble in Paradise. White supremacists in Idaho mar the Los Angeles police retirees' tranquility. That's the name of the article. December the 14th, 1986. And I'll do a lot more for you on this, but the gist of the article is that 30 members of the Los Angeles Police Department have settled right next to Aryan Nation's founder, Richard Butler, who wants that northwest area to be an all-white state, is designated as all-white. And veterans of the police squad who attacked the Black Panthers or worked SWAT team that burnt and took care of the Symbionese Liberation Army, these former policemen are now up in Idaho with Richard Butler. Now, Richard Butler was an engineer at Lockheed, working on the U-2. He calls himself a minister, and he wants to take over the world and kill all the blacks and Jews in the world. And the LAPD was described by Louis Tackwood, who worked for the Squad 19 and the very people that were involved in the SLA. He said that the LAPD wanted to form a Gestapo. And it's very dangerous that up in Hayden Lake, next to Mr. Butler, are 30 members of the LAPD who worked attacking the Black Panthers and on the SLA project, because SLA was a totally created fabric of the Defense Department, the FBI, Ronald Reagan, and Ed Meese at the time. And these two factors, the LAPD and Ed Butler, 30 of them up in Idaho, is a very bad sign. Also, there was an article in People's Daily World, January the 6th, U.S. arms thefts tied to the Ku Klux Klan. And what is happening is the extreme right-wing forces that link directly to our military and to Mr. Butler from Lockheed and to Mr. Pierce, who worked for United Technology and for the Air Force, who is the head of the Nazi Party in the eastern area in Washington and in Virginia. They are taking weapons and missiles and various things to overthrow this country and giving them to the clans and the Nazis. And the taking out of these armories for these agencies is a very bad sign because they link directly to Mr. Butler, who formerly worked at Lockheed. Also, there was an article came over Reuters this past week, January the 4th, Souvenirs at Hitler's Resort, called Nazi Nostalgia, and it tells about Berchtesgaden and surviving the Eagle's Nest, the people down below, and how they have a souvenir shop and they sell pictures of Adolf Hitler and so forth. But one of the things that was interesting here was that they plan to have the 1992 Winter Olympics at Berchtesgaden, and they're already selling these pictures of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi era. Well, last week I talked about the importance of Fritz Kramer, the secret team. I've been doing that for 16 years on the air, but now it's really heating up. But you can say for all purposes, now Ronald Reagan is through. The team isn't out. The work is to get rid of the team, but Reagan is through. The game is over. The handwriting is on the wall. The two articles that I'm citing for proof of this or evidence of it, one is from Roland Evans and Robert Novak, the very two people who wrote last week that the sun was shining because the National Security Council was retaining Fritz Kramer, and this strategic arms specialist Kramer would never be sacrificed while others moved out as they clean out the NSC. 7 days later, they wrote for the Washington Post and the Houston Post, the Reagan presidency is dead. And the article says that key aides are buoyed up by the ratings, congratulate themselves on their survival, but the reality is that Reagan is dead. I'm afraid it's all over, said a mournful conservative, and the public's long love affair with Reagan has lost its magic, and he is on the way out. And when they say that, you can be sure that that is the sign to move him out, who is next, and they're pushing this Pat Buchanan presidency for all it is worth. Incidentally, I received the Washington Post article about Fritz Kramer, and it's different than the Houston Post. The Washington Post syndicated column refers to Fritz Kramer two times. The Washington Post rather leaves out one of the paragraphs that is in the Houston Post, which I think is significant. The Washington Post says on top of the that cleaning out the National Security Council and putting in Mr. Ehrmarth and Sorzano, hardline arms control specialist Fritz Kramer unexpectedly is being retained, and they never mention him again. And in the Houston Post, the same article says Mr. Carlucci quickly gave up cleaning out the NSC because it would have sacrificed the high talent that he has, including strategic arms specialist Kramer. Now, that sentence was left out of the Washington Post. I took the two articles this week side by side, and no paragraph or word was left out, so it isn't a question of space, but Kramer's name was only mentioned one time. The other omen, the second omen that there's trouble in Washington, has to do with an article I read in New Solidarity, December 19th, Files on Gun Runner Hashemi Sought in Court Appeal. Now, the gist of this is Cyrus Hashemi was murdered in London this past July. He's one of the connecting links to JINSA, J-I-N-S-A, the Israeli organization that is part and parcel of our own Defense Department, along with Mr. Churba, who's closely tied to the Mooney organization, and Michael LEDEEN. But the interesting thing about this article, there's a lawsuit to get the records of Hashemi that were filed a couple of years ago, and the Justice Department held them up, and then the case was refiled, and because of the story of the Iran gate breaking with Mr. Khashoggi and Mr. Hashemi, and Hashemi is one of 17 defendants who were sending arms to Iran and mentioned George Bush on their tape recordings and in their trial. But the interesting thing about opening up this case of Hashemi, Khashoggi, the Israeli Mossad, and so forth, is the article said that an attorney by the name of Bernard Fensterwald III is representing Edward Spanaus, S-P-A-N-N-A-U-S, to get these papers in the open. Bernard Fensterwald was the attorney for James McCord at the time of Watergate, also Marianne Paisley of the CIA when John Paisley died. And when Bernard Fensterwald comes into a case, I was waiting to see when he would open into the Iran CONTRAGATE, because then the chips begin to fall and spread along the side, and certain people are able to spin off, some fatally, some career-wise and otherwise. But it was FENSTERWALD who took McCord to Judge Sirica's, or vice versa. They went together, and when McCord said, there are things going on here in the Justice Department, in the White House, in the CIA, these various lies, and I want to present my attorney, Bernard FENSTERWALD. So when FENSTERWALD gets into this case, that is the biggest similarity to Watergate so far, and the story that he is going to take, he says, to the Supreme Court is a very big piece of this whole CONTRAGATE, Iran-gate scandal. The article I saw this in came from Richmond, Virginia. It says the FBI's continuing cover-up of the Iranian gun runner and Khomeini-backed terrorism is at issue in a case appealing the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit Court here of Edward Spanius versus the Justice Department. Hashemi died under mysterious circumstances in July in London. He has surfaced in the news recently as one of the purported middlemen of the 1986 arms deal involving Saudi dealer Adnan Khashoggi. Hashemi is in fact one of the key figures involved in arms trafficking to Iran, going on through Zbigniew, Brzezinski, and Jimmy Carter since 1979. This lawsuit involves information on Hashemi and the corporation that put Hashemi into business, the First Gulf Bank and Trust Company, which was set up by Merrill Lynch in Switzerland. The money came through First Gulf. Hashemi's involvement in the 1970-80 hostage crisis, in the 1980 assassination of anti-Khomeini spokesman Ali Tabatabai, illegal weapons trafficking by Hashemi, and it also involves former Justice Department official J. Stanley Pottinger and the FBI's losing of the tape recordings of Pottinger representing Hashemi. Elliot Richardson of the Justice Department was a lawyer for Hashemi, and Pottinger was also a lawyer, and Pottinger was on the board of one of the two corporations, or both, that Hashemi set up in Panama and down in Central America, with the money, as I say, coming from Donald Reagan's Merrill Lynch. Now, this article is a bombshell. I'll do more details on Hashemi and the links to Michael LEDEEN, to Jinsa, to the generals in Israel, the Mossad, to our own Defense Department through Mr. Churba, their links to Reverend Moon. This is a very important story, just like the Evans and Novak one, that Reagan's presidency is dead. The next one I saw this week of importance was the one of FENSTERWALD taking the case to open up the Hashemi case, and he says if the court doesn't open it up, December the 10th, the oral argument of attorney FENSTERWALD said, representing Mr. Spanaus, an attorney who has this attorney representing him, he told the three-judge panel the case should be remanded and sent back to the district court for rehearing. And following the hearing, FENSTERWALD said if the Court of Appeals denies the Spanaus appeal, he will take the case to the United States Supreme Court, and that will be an interesting day. I also have an article, many of them along this line, Why Did the Justice Department Protect the Drug Pushers? This is about Fidel Castro, who has Robert Vesco living in the Caribbean, going in and out of Cuba, and now the Justice Department protected Robert Vesco all this time with his drug running and the patronage of a Carlos Leder, Lehder, and the case involves the Bank of the Compagnie des Services Fiduciaires, which is a Swiss consulting bank located in Geneva, Switzerland, which is the bank that Robert McFarlane used and the 208 committee used, and for their trips to Iran and the money that was put in there. And it also has to do with Edmund Safra's Republic National Bank, and I've done broadcasts on Safra and Donald Reagan and Henry Kissinger and investments down in Brazil. This is a ball of wax that also involves Albert Hakim and Richard Secord from Stanford Technology that was set up from TCI, Otto von Bolschwing's network, out here in Palo Alto. And it goes into the Zucker connections. I have large articles to share with you, and there was a huge one in the Wall Street Journal this past week called the Zucker Connection. Who runs CFS, this bank that is causing so much trouble because of all the missing money? Where did $10 million go here? Where did $2 million go? Or another $10 million? And Willard Zucker is a leading participant in the connecting link between Albert Hakim and Richard Secord of Stanford Technology, formerly TCI, and also the links to Robert Vesco. Zucker joined Bernie Cornfeld his investors' overseas services, and I suggest if you want to know some of these intricacies, get several good books or paperbacks on Robert Vesco and read those. And it has to do with Kenneth Bialkin of the Anti-Defamation League and some top Israelis, and also John Singlaub and the World Anti-Communist League, Ariel Sharon and Alexander Haig. So when Fensterwald opens up those papers, just sit around and watch the feathers fly as they did in Watergate. The Houston Post had an article by William V. Shannon, reprinted from the Boston Globe, Kansas City Times, titled "Challenger Disaster Was a Grim Omen for Reagan." And that's what I said the minute the Challenger went up. And those tapes or the telephone conversations of the White House of the National Security Council have never been released to find out who caused the Challenger to go up in the cold. And after that, it exploded and hydrogen leaked through the O-ring it couldn't hold in the cold weather. This article says the 6-year jinx that befalls many two-term presidents hit Ronald Reagan with full force in 1986 on January 28th in the morning of the day of which he was to have given his State of the Union message. The Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated 73 seconds after launching, and 7 astronauts were killed. The Challenger disaster was a grim omen of the year that followed Ronald Reagan. The full story of why it was sent up on the fateful day has not yet been told. The secrecy and manipulation of information that have characterized the administration from the outset were to produce severe political damage by the president's year. And he had to face that, and they had to work with the Challenger explosion and hired William Rogers, who's a law partner, William Casey of the CIA, and Alton Keel, who from the National Security Council was the liaison of Rogers to the White House. Keel's now gone on to NATO, and he's taken the place of Mr. Abshire from the Georgetown Center of Strategic International Studies, who is now at the White House covering up messes there, and Abshire wants to become CIA director, and the Challenger story was the first accident. This article says, and remember the chronology I gave you for the worst stories of the year in February, the Marcos were driven out of Philippines, and of course William Rogers and William Casey, the office of Rogers and Wells, were the bankers for the Marcos with their corrupt money in New York City and Panama and Cayman Islands. Then they go on to the Libya bombings, April 15th, and that was the Department of National Security Council disinformation. And they cite the Statue of Liberty observation, an event mixed with patriotism and sentiment. And that's when we displayed the first ship that sailed. The Liberty belonged to Adolf Hitler. It was his ship. And the Chilean torture ship was the fourth in line for that grim parade. Then they referred to when Reagan met Soviet Chairman Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, and that's when things really began to come down. Whatever happened to Reykjavik and the Danloff story are kingpins in pulling the plug out of Ronald Reagan, stories that were building up all through the year. The article is titled, "Challenger Disaster Was a Grim Omen for Reagan," Kansas City Times, January the 1st, 1987. Now, there's a few stories I'm going to go through very quickly with you. I'm not going to cover the details or names. Most of the articles I'm going to run through just to show you what's in the news just this past week that has accumulated. Most of them I've put on paper, 10 by 14 inches. There's so much material, and we'll take those articles later in depth. I just want to run through them as quickly as I can. One funny story was the Muslim SWAMI linked to arms sales. Canadian investors tied to a religious leader who advises the Sultan of Brunei. This cast of characters is so unbelievable, with the Mossad, the generals of Israeli intelligence that's supposed to be so smart, working with Saudi Arabians like Khashoggi, and organized crime and drug running and death assassination teams are all tangled together. But when you get into an element that Ronald Reagan never imagined, like working with the Iranians in the Middle East, people in the Muslim, the SWAMI, whose money is being used and they can't find it, a lot more is going to come out besides Bernard Fensterwald representing a case to open up the Hashemi gun running to Iran. This is a crowd that you don't lose a gambling bet with of $5, much less 10 million here, 2 million there, and another 8 or 10 million here or there. A story from the Los Angeles Times, January the 8th. Dealers may have lost big. Iran scheme cheated financiers. They may have lost millions. Reagan is in real trouble when you get into losing millions. As I say, you don't play this kind of game unless you know where you're going to get the money. Another long article from the Washington Post by Michael Isikoff, January the 4th. And you might, I hope you tape these off the air so you can play back the sources. I'm not copying articles. People write me letters and say, send me this article. I simply do not have time to do it. I'll give you the source and date. You have to go to the library yourself. Deals of developer KHASHOGGI building frustration in Utah. Millions are sought from Utah, where there are about 500 or 50 to 500 lawsuits. He was going to build this huge triad America. He dug a hole that was so big that it's next to the Mormon church, and it's excavated. There's nothing going up there. He was going to put a $600 million building downtown, anchored by 2 gold-colored 43-story office towers. He's left town, and the lawsuits are piling up, and there's debts and demands for over $100 million in unpaid notes and bills, 47 different lawsuits, and 100 people were laid off just from the Triad Corporation, 100 people with homes and rent and so forth. This is a long article, not only 10 by 14, it's 2 pages in the Washington Post, how angry in Utah they are and how it's affecting the economy there. The San Francisco Examiner had a story, along with the New York Times. It was interesting because when we get into the case of Mr. Channel and political money to overthrow those electorates that are against the Contras or that are against Star Wars, there were other political machinations, going on all this time. An interesting story, January the 10th, from the San Jose Mercury, Dominelli ruling sets code for election ads. The gist of it is this, that financier Jay Dominelli, who's gone to jail for absconding with millions of dollars, the fine on the law office of William Rogers and William Casey was $40 million just fine. Dominelli took a lot of money, goodness knows where it is, and ran, and then came back. And this is a suit that was set in San Francisco, charging that the J. Dominelli Company in 1980 blasted President Carter on the eve of the 1980 elections, and he had ads in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Chicago Tribune, and put all this money. Allegedly, he didn't work with any particular party, so it wasn't authorized by a particular candidate to run against Jimmy Carter. But now it turns out, or it turned out this past year, that Dominelli's lawyer was Casey, who would become CIA director. He was managing Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1980 at the time the Carter papers were gone, the Cartergate, the time that Michael LEDEEN was pulling the Billygate, and the hostages were kept in Iran under promise and deals, hold them until Reagan is elected. And so on top of those machinations between Channel's offices and the Cartergate, Billygate, and the money to Iran for weapons, it turns out that Dominelli, who said he was acting alone in San Diego, actually was not acting alone. His lawyer was the man who gained the most by becoming the CIA director. He gained a lot then. He's not gaining a lot now, but he thought he would hold on to a lot. So I have an article that I had on the air a long time ago about the Dominelli case. This was in February 21st, just at the time the Challenger case was going on, and William Rogers was investigating the Challenger. In the explosion on the Challenger, the mishap when 7 died. And at the time I had this story from New York Times, Rogers and Wells has agreed to a $40 million settlement with investors who charged the law firm with securities fraud, negligent malpractice in connection with the representation of J. Dominelli in San Diego, and his fraudulent investment scheme collapsed in 1984. Another law office, Loeb and Loeb in Los Angeles, lost $28 million in the scheme. But the point is that the soon CIA director, William Casey, who was the manager of the president's campaign, Ronald Reagan's campaign, his client was placing ads in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and other papers around the country on why you shouldn't vote for Jimmy Carter. I think this has to be looked into in the election, Iran scam, and we have to get this to the committees in Washington while they're looking into these other matters. Now, who are the people in Washington doing the investigations before we start sending them letters? I want to do a little bit about several areas that many of you have seen these articles, some of you haven't. One is on Lawrence Walsh, the new chief prosecutor for investigator for the Iran Gate, CONTRAGATE stories. The story about him is from the Washington Times, by Mr. Doyle. This is a Mooney paper. This is what they have about Lawrence Walsh. I want to talk about him and Mr. Carlucci and the team in the White House protecting the president now, because all three of them seem to be of the same fabric and they have to be watched very carefully. The article says Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel investigating the Iran-Contra affair, was the director and lawyer for nearly 2 decades, 20 years, of a pharmaceutical company whose prescription drugs allegedly caused birth defects and cataracts. Richardson Merrill, Incorporated, Wilton, Connecticut, admitted in 1964 it supplied the government with falsified laboratory documents about its anti-cholesterol drug Mer-29 in the court. This is a lawyer that worked 20 years for Merrill Richardson when they presented falsified documents to a court. The article says the firms spent tens of millions of dollars in related costs by the late 1970s and early 80s to keep Benedictine, another drug, a morning sickness plagued by litigation, claiming it was linked to birth defects on the market. In 1980, Richardson Merrill paid Mr. Walsh $3.3 million for his fees to protect the drug company. Mr. Walsh left Merrill Richardson as director in 1981. He was chosen as independent counsel last week. His office of public service included posts of director of the Waterfront Commission in New York's Harbor, deputy attorney general, and negotiated Vietnam peace talks. Since 1961, Mr. Walsh worked as a defense lawyer for corporate clients. Merrill Richardson was among his chief. If he got that many million, he's a very rich man, $3.3 million, and there's a lot of sick and deformed people. Extensive biographical notes made public by the U.S. Court of Appeals, as well as his listing in Who's Who in America, don't mention his ties to the pharmaceutical firm. He began as an outside counsel for Richardson Merrill soon after he left the Justice Department in 1961 to become a partner in the blue-chip Wall Street firm of Davis, Polk, and Wardwell. He was a board member of Richardson Merrill, the drug firm, in 1964. He served on the board of directors until 1981, according to the company records. He was a minor stockholder in the company, and then it was acquired by Dow Chemical in 1981. He still holds stock. Merrill Richardson's market performance through the 60s and 70s, while he was their chief attorney, was clouded with 3 problem-ridden prescription drugs: thalidomide, Mer-29, and Benedictine. Thalidomide, a sedative administered to pregnant women, was not developed by Merrill Richardson, but the firm was a U.S. licensee. It tested the drug on the domestic market in 1980 by dispersing millions of samples to physicians and sold the drug in Canada and also in Germany. For those of you who are too young to remember the thalidomide case, that's when children were born with fins, sort of like sea mammals with no arms and legs, and it was a horrendous case. And I have a book on the thalidomide, which it was hard to obtain. It's very hard to get that book, and I can see why. The people involved in defending it have to move up and take care of investigations like this. The article says in June 1960, Merrill Richardson marketed the drug Mer-29. They developed it in-house to reduce cholesterol. The side effects were cataracts, vomiting, loss of hair. It was taken off the market after the FDA inspectors seized a federal grand jury investigation and a record that the grand jury was going into it. Merrill Richardson and 3 executives pleaded no contest in 1964 that the company falsified their lab records on animals. They were only fined $80,000. Walsh also represented not only Mayer, that was the subject of 500 civil suits. The company paid $200 million in damages, according to an October 80 issue of Science magazine. The controversy over Benedictine began to flare in 1978 in Orlando, Florida, where a couple filed a $12 million lawsuit against Merrill Richardson because of their son's birth defects. Mr. Walsh was chief defense counsel of that lawsuit, which became the first Benedictine case to go to trial. It involved 3 years of multi-million-dollar pretrial. The case resulted in a $20,000 jury verdict to pay the boy's medical expenses. Richardson and Merrill began selling Benedictine in 1956. It was the only FDA drug for morning sickness. It was nearly 2,000 damage claimed and several hundred claims overseas. Richardson Merrill was dissolved in 1981. Its over-the-counter product became Richardson Vicks, and the drugs division was acquired by Dow Chemical. Richardson Merrill stockholders, including Mr. Walsh, received Dow Chemical stock, which he now gets and earns a lot of money from that. And the article goes on to say how the price doubled at Dow and he made a lot of money in addition to legal fees. But the chief prosecutor for this case was heavily involved in protecting victims of drugs, and evidence that was suppressed or not put out right in order to cheat people of the money they would get as a result of having to take these drugs. The next person we'll go into just one item, or one long article and several others to back up this one, has to do with Mr. Frank Carlucci, the new man in charge of our National Security Council. I think we better take a 1-minute break before I get into Carlucci, because there's a lot of material on him, but I want to show you the fine quality of Ronald Reagan and the investigators there to get to the bottom of the matter. As I say, we'll take a 1-minute break and go right on to Frank Carlucci. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half hour of a 1-hour broadcast. Second half of broadcast number 788. If you tuned in the beginning of the other half of the broadcast or any other time when you don't get the whole broadcast, you can write to me, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll tell you how to obtain the tapes of the broadcast in case you missed part of it. Now on to Frank Carlucci. I'm referring now to a long article in the Wall Street Journal, January the 9th, 1987, titled New National Security Chief's Ties to Men Cited in the Iran Crisis. Illegal arms deals may cloud the investigation. Now, I have a habit of reading an article through before I see who wrote it to see if I can pick up the temper or the mind of the person writing it in the way it's written, and I got down to about 2 paragraphs and had to look, and it was Jonathan Quitney. He's one of the best investigators for the Wall Street Journal. He's written endless articles on, or quite a few extensive, on the Nugan Bank. He's written a book called Endless Enemies, which is a very good book, like Penny Lanew's In Banks We Trust. If you don't have these books, write to me again, self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll tell you where to obtain them. Jonathan Quitney wrote, Frank Charles Carlucci III, who is President Reagan's National Security Advisor, has ordered wholesale staff changes, and friends have enjoyed, who have long enjoyed his loyalty, predict he'll cleanse the NSC in the wake of the Iran-Contra arms scandal. But there is a shadow on Mr. Carlucci's prospects, his house-clinging prospects. It is whether old loyalties he's shown to a member of a circle that seems deeply involved in the shadowy world of overseas arms sales and secret dealings will be exposed in terms of the Iran-Contra scandal. These involve the former associates of Edwin Wilson, the former U.S. intelligence operative who made millions of dollars illegally by selling U.S. arms to Muammar Gaddafi. And Mr. Carlucci has a close working business relationship with 2 people who were very much tied up to Edwin Wilson's operations. These men, he acknowledged, had been close to Mr. Wilson, and he had invested great faith in these 2 men. They were never formally charged with a plot to steal taxpayers' money on arms shipments to Egypt, but there were millions of dollars, and the taxpayers should have objected. Jonathan Quitney and others wrote about it at the time. I talked about it on the air years ago, but the shipments went on, and these men made a lot of money. 3 years ago, the Justice Department declined to prosecute the 2 men, Major General Richard Secord and Eric von Marbot. Now, von Marbot is important. I don't know his relationship to the notorious Fritz Kramer, the background of the man, but we know that Secord comes out of TCI, which was the Otto von Bolschwing, Helene von Damm network. Mr. Hakim, formerly of Iran, American citizen, and Secord come right out of the von Bolschwing, the Reinhard Gehlen operation out here in Silicon Valley. So Secord and von Marbot are very closely linked to Carlucci. The article goes on, by various accounts, both were occasional visitors in Mr. Wilson's $4 million Virginia estate. He was making $32,000 a year as a civil servant. He had just finished his stint in Navy intelligence. He also worked in Navy intelligence under Henry Kissinger and George Bush with Task Force 157. Mr. Carlucci confirmed that as the Deputy Defense Secretary in 1982, he overrode the Pentagon General Counsel and personally rescued General Secord's career when the general was suspended because of a grand jury investigation into his dealings. With Mr. Wilson, Secord wasn't indicted. He later resigned his senior Pentagon post, and now he's the kingpin, Secord, of arming the illegal arms to Nicaragua, to the Contras, and also arming illegally the weapons sent to Iran. Some current and former law enforcement officials who were active in the Egyptian arms investigation are furious over Carlucci's reinstatement of Secord in 1982. Now Secord has become a focal point of the current scandal. Now, in addition to Bernard Festerwald representing the group that want to open up the Hashemi, Israeli, Mossad, Khashoggi connections at another angle, when you get people in the Justice Department, Defense Department furious at Secord getting off the hook, and with his friend von Marbod, and Carlucci hiring them, and they're involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, and he's heavily involved with these people. He's supposed to clean out the NSC, and it was the NSC who hired his very friends, Secord, and worked with North and Singlaub, and the NSC worked with the buddies that he has been business-wise associated with and also protected from prosecution. And Mr. Edwin Wilson's in jail, and I'm sure he doesn't appreciate that either. This article continues, it was Mr. von Marbod that Mr. Carlucci had the closest ties. Von Marbod was the Pentagon's chief arms sales official until he resigned under investigation in the Egyptian arms scandal. And that involved Alexander Haig and George Bush and the murder of Anwar Sadat when Mr. Mubarak came in. He doesn't put this in here, but this is where that time slot fits. Although it was determined that the transactions Mr. von Marbod had approved of had led to massive abuses, it was decided there was too little information to charge him with criminal misconduct. That's the way Stanley Pottinger got off the Justice Department investigation of Hashemi with guns to Iran in 1982. The tape recordings of his voice were lost, and they said there's too little information. So Elliot Richardson and Stanley Pottinger of the Defense Department got off on their charges, and Hashemi was back in business, doing what he did best, and Mr. von Marbod and General Secord have been continuing. They don't even get a slap on the hand, and they're back in business with the NSC and the Defense Department. Mr. Carlucci left the Defense Department in 1982 when he became president of Sears Roebuck, the Sears Roebuck unit that is making weapons. It has to do with shipping weapons, and now closing their doors. He brought von Marbod along with a $200,000 a year job as a consultant. Roderick Hills, former chairman of the SEC, said he was the original chairman of Sears World Trade, who left it in 1984, says Eric von Marbod was at least chief of staff for Frank Carlucci. Eric read all his mail, answered all questions, went to all meetings. Susan Clough, Carlucci's assistant, and a former personal secretary to President Carter, to the President of the United States, said Mr. von Marbod was one of three people most influential with Mr. Carlucci, the other being his wife, and the other the former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. So we have a case where I read last week or the week before how Oliver North was over William Casey. Casey took orders from him. Well, in this case, von Marbod, who's living in Paris now, was over Carlucci and those other people that have to fit in with Fred Eakley and Fritz Kramer and the secret team and give these public servants their marching orders. He now works for LTV Corporation in Europe. The relationship of Wilson, Secord, and von Marbod and the former CIA officer Thomas Cline, and that's one of the defendants in the Christic Institute case for gun running, narcotics traffic, and assassinations and assassination attempts down in Costa Rica, was reported by the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post in October 82. And I have all of those articles going back to 82. That's how I know who these characters are. The Wall Street Journal story concerned a 1979 Egyptian arms deal that resulted in a $10,000 criminal fine for a holding company headed by Mr. Cline and the repayment of $3 million of an alleged $8 million illegal profit made by an Egyptian-American transport and services company called EATSCO. Now, Thomas Cline was reprimanded by the CIA because of this money, this illegal profit. He gave back 3 of the 8, which means he still had 5. And he wasn't allowed, according to the accounts, another large article, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal this past week on Thomas Cline. He wasn't allowed to be hired by the CIA because of these problems of these overruns of millions of dollars. So when he couldn't be hired by the CIA, then he was hired by William Casey to work for the National Security Council. When Mr. Secord can't work for the Pentagon because of the overcharges, then Secord works for the National Security Council, General Secord. So these people can't be fired. They're just changed to another agency. But then the pivotal question is, why does William Casey not blow the whistle on Cline's as he moves up into the White House? Why didn't they blow the whistle on Secord and Carlucci take him along with him for $200,000 a year at another job? And the answer is because they all work with a secret team and they can't be punished or removed. So the cost overruns and the so-called problems were ignored, and these people get hired again, even though their bosses know exactly what they did and probably why they did it. This article says Mr. Cline's played a role in the secret national security dealings with Iran. He also used funds borrowed from Mr. Wilson to establish IDAHO. That was a Swiss company. It's written up. Some of these details are written up by Peter Moss in Manhunt, referring to these four men and their work in a 1979 correspondence between Edwin Wilson and his lawyer and Mr. Cline's lawyer. Mr. Moss refers to this in the book. Wilson talked about this joint ownership. A January 18, 1979 memo from Wilson talks about four individuals and U.S. citizens, and that has to do with von Marbod, Cline's, and Secord, as long as with Edwin Wilson. Mr. Carlucci said he first met Mr. von Marbod when he proposed for the Pentagon arms job. Carlucci was so impressed, he battled the Joint Chief of Staff to make the appointment. They wanted a military man for the job. So where does von Marbod come from? Where does he come in? Just as Fritz Kramer was a private and then a lieutenant in the United States Army, and he becomes a plans officer over the whole Pentagon. I bring this out to illustrate the things I've been talking about for the last few weeks and the last few years. This is a long article from the Wall Street Journal, New NSC Chief and His Ties to the Past. Then Willie Carto in Spotlight ran several articles on the same matter, called White House Selects Security Chief. The old pro is their safe bet. And this goes into the work that Carlucci had in the Office of Management Budget, what he did in Portugal in 1975. In 1982, his working with Richard Pearl and Stephen Bryan, and of course they fit closely in with Rafi Eitan and Michael LEDEEN, and the Mossad connections. And the article goes on about Mr. Eric von Mobard, the former head of the Defense Security Agency, the Defense Security Assistance Agency, and retired Air Force General Secord, and their work with Carlucci and how he's now brought them, these people, their past, he's brought into the National Security Council, and he's supposed to be cleaning it out. They also refer to Kenneth D. Graffenreid, who moved up to serve as Special Assistant to the President for Intelligence and Counterterrorism in the NSC, and his relationship to Middle Eastern diplomats and also to de Marbod and the gang, Secord, and so forth. And then that's Hakim and Stanford Technology. The power behind these people, behind the appointments in the White House, was Helene von Damm from TCI, Secord and Hakim working with the company that TCI formed, and they are now strongly linked to the man known as Frank Carlucci. Carlucci was instrumental, incidentally, working with Zbigniew Brzezinski, trying to stir up revolution in Poland, forming Solidarity, and he was active as a not only in helping a coup in the Congo and also in Brazil, but a political activist in every sense of the word. He also works close with Howard Teicher, who just left the NSC. He headed the disinformation campaign, which would include the lies about the KAL, the Challenger, the Libya downing, the invasion of Grenada, and the Danilov arrest and meeting in the Soviet Union that formed the Reykjavik Conference. The article, December 29th from Spotlight, refers to Carlucci and not only his sales with Eric von Marbod, but with Theodore Shackley, his business connections. And of course, Shackley, again, is one of the defendants in the Christic Institute case down involving murders and gun running and drugs in Costa Rica coming into the United States. And the whole team has a good friend in the NSC named Frank Carlucci. And of course, Carlucci is holding on to their old friend, the highest of them all, Fritz Kramer. Another spotlight article, scandal, the story Mike Wallace won't print, and it's about CBS and Richard Secord, Frank Carlucci, and ex-CIA agent Edwin Wilson and Albert Hakim. And the interesting thing is that this past week I had maybe 40 articles on Hakim and Secord, and again, they come from Stanford Technology, Otto von Bolschwing's outfit. The attorney that formed the corporate papers before that TCI was Simon Rifkin, who's the attorney for Henry Kissinger. And these people have a lot of exposure now. A lot of articles are coming out, and we'll see how far it goes. The secret team that I mentioned last week on the air was visible on television again this past week. Oh, pardon me, I got the paper saying in my... there's a 1 hour program on NBC. That's Henry Kissinger's favorite station. He's an advisor to all of them. And it was a program on terrorism and what to expect in arms dealers and the Israelis' role. And the first person interviewed, of course, was Henry Kissinger, who was introduced as an expert on the National Security Council, giving his opinions of Washington. Then came Edward Luttwak from the Center of Strategic and International Studies, who wrote a book, Coup d'etat, just prior to the overthrow of this country. It came out in 1962, just before Dallas. Lawrence Eagleburger was another guest. He's a member of Kissinger Associates, talking about the White House and arms smuggling. They don't have much to say, and I typed up what they said, but it's the generalities. It's just that the team is always visible. This is the team that runs our country and doesn't get touched by the scandals. The fourth person interviewed on this team was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who worked very, very closely with Frank Carlucci and with the National Security Council, no matter who's in office. And then the last person on there of interest was Marvin Kalb, who has been the newspaper reporter, author, along with Kissinger Associates, his entire career, talking about terrorism and gun running. So the whole Kissinger, Brzezinski, Kramer team, Eagleburger, Luttwak, and all of them are on the media over and over again. I think I read that they had 500 hours accumulated on television since the Iran Gate story came. A little bit overdone, I would believe. No, it was since the Berlin disco. The article I'm citing is by Karl Blois from the People's Daily World. The right-wing think tank may have planned the Iran deal. And this is before Mr. Abshire was put on to guard the White House and advise the president. He came right out of the Georgetown think tank. I've mentioned that. So we have Carlucci with the National Security Council and Mr. Walsh representing the special prosecution, the special prosecutor. And then, of course, right behind them as the appointment right out of Georgetown Center of the very gentleman who's in charge of it, David Abshire, who will correlate the information that comes to the president as it comes. The article that I'm citing that came out in November said between the West Berlin disco bombing and the Chernobyl nuclear explosion, the Center for Strategic and International Studies fellows figured in over 600 radio and television broadcasts, articles, and opinion columns. Whether because of editorial laziness, ignorance, or political affinity, CSIS propagandists and international operatives appear regularly on everything from cable news network to National Public Radio, and of course ABC, NBC, CNN, CBS. LEDEEN is practically a regular columnist for the Los Angeles Times, as is Jeane Kirkpatrick, as is Henry Kissinger. And I think more and more as the people begin to spin off who are expendable in this case, you'll find that these people from that center continue to dominate the news media. And it's interesting, in this article about the right-wing think tank, it talks about Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Jeane Kirkpatrick, how the money comes from Justin Dart and the Scaife Foundation, the Mellon family, and published accounts of activities that link McFarlane to Michael LEDEEN. McFarlane comes from that center. He's there now. Michael LEDEEN is there. And they can travel to Israel with David Kimchi, or they can go to Iran and meet Mr. Manker Gorbanifar. But these people have a clique of their own that come out of there. And it's interesting that somebody has noticed that there were 600 radio and television shows by them alone. They seem to dominate the news. The same Karl Blois wrote an article, Reagan appoints a fox to guard the chickens, the appointment of the founder or the past director of Georgetown Center for Strategic International Studies is a point man in the Iran Gate scandal, and he is to wipe out, I guess, displeasing things to the president's ear because the president is still euphoric, but he's been assigned to be in charge of the coordination of material as it comes into the White House. I might have mentioned this before. He's the former U.S. representative to NATO. He was brought into the Nixon team when it was besieged, and he defended the president against charges connected with the illegal, brutal bombing of Campuchia. On July the 30th, 1973, the House Judiciary Committee voted positively on the third of 3 articles of impeachment. 2 additional acts, one of tax fraud and the other of illegally concealing the bombing of Campuchia, were rejected by a vote of 26 to 12. So they refused to put this in the impeachment proceedings against Richard Nixon. They claimed this was a foreign matter, that this man took care of things overseas and not domestically, and they took away the bombing, and that involved, of course, Henry Kissinger's bombing. This article says Abshire was brought in to defend secret warfare. He has also Reaganite credentials. He was one of 11 U.S. ambassadors who publicly reprimanded Secretary of State Schultz for their unprecedented joint endorsement of the 1986 re-election bid of ultra-rightist Senator Jesse Helms. He was one of the 11 who was reprimanded by Schultz. They're not supposed to go out for a particular candidate. The Georgetown Center is well known for the likes of Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jean Kirkpatrick, Robert McFarlane, and Michael LEDEEN, and Abshire is perfect for the job because he will be there taking in information about what these particular people do. And again, they're on the news all of the time. Now, one of the most scary articles to come out this past week, following the material I had on Fritz Kramer and Fred Eakley and the chain of command the last few weeks, it's titled Applying Military Brain to Military Brawn Again. This is the New York Times, December 17th. The main title is Pentagon by John Cushman. And it says that every few years the military establishment takes its intellectual energy and plans a new national security strategy. In 1950, a plan was designated NSC 68. It was produced by Paul Nietzsche of Arms Control about the growing Soviet Union. It allowed us to get into the Korean War. And, of course, the Korean War was excused to bring people like the Waffen-SS, Otto von Bolschwing, to the United States. The Nazis poured into this country after 1950 under the excuse of the North Koreans going down into South Korea. We had a worse invasion here than they had in South Korea. This article said on Monday a group of military experts got together to send a set of plans to Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger and the new head of the NSC, Frank Carlucci. And it says officials associated with this panel say it will advise Carlucci through him the White House on matters ranging from the support of insurgencies, those are our covert actions, to overthrow countries against other governments, and to nuclear war strategies incorporating anti-missile defenses and the Star Wars. The panel, officially called the Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy, was formed without public notice this several months ago, headed by Dr. Fred Eakley, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the Pentagon's third-ranking civilian, and by Dr. Albert Wolfstetter, an advisor to Dr. Eakley, former government national security official. Now, this was a few months ago that the panel got together, and Dr. Fred Eakley is the gentleman that Mr. Singlaub, General Singlaub, and General Secord went to illegally have counterinsurgency using the CIA and the Defense Department to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, and also to overthrow Khomeini, send arms to Iran, and get that revolution going also, or else to pay Khomeini for holding the hostages till Reagan had gotten elected. This is a long-time payment, I believe, that was promised to Khomeini. The group's task, according to Dr. Eakley, the same Eakley that worked with and shares offices with Fritz Kramer, I had that on the air, and a listener to World Watcher sent me that article about a 1981 statement of the relationship of Eakley and Kramer, which is still very thick, because Kramer's right there in the NSC with Carlucci, who works with Secord and Hakim from Stanford Technology, the Reinhard Gehlen group, that would work with Fritz Kramer, of course. But here are the people that will be working with the panel, and they will decide the foreign policies, it says, for the next 15 to 20 years. The experts on the panel are Dr. Fred Eakley, this is the partner of Fritz Kramer, Zbigniew Brzezinski, it's the partner of Carlucci, in kicking up solidarity and trying to get a revolution going in Poland. W. Graham Claytor Jr., I'll have to go to the library and look that up in Who's Who or some books there. I don't know that name. Then there's William Clark. Now, when did William Clark become a great strategist? He was the NSC chief. He was in Army intelligence when he brought Helene von Damm to this country from Czechoslovakia and Germany when she became the appointment secretary for the governor in California and then the president, the same man being Ronald Reagan. William Clark will be with this committee, and Henry Kissinger, of course. So we have everybody but Alexander Haig on this tableau, and then Ann Armstrong is there with this group. She heads Mr. Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, which has Henry Kissinger and others among that board. Officials say the strategy being sought will respond to a wide variety of threats as possible. They will endorse the Star Wars and so forth. So in continuity with the secret team, here they are again, planning their strategies for, according to the New York Times, 15 or 20 years. Ickley, Brzezinski, Clark, Kissinger, and we don't know Graham Claytor. I'll have to look that up for you. Another article, part of an article that was interesting this week, was a chronology of the Iran-Israeli connections, and it begins in 1978, December the 3rd, with Brzezinski, the same advisor that is going to be working on plans for the next 20 years, who tried to destabilize Poland and have a revolution there, and worked with Michael LEDEEN and Paul Henson, Claire Sterling, in creating the fabric that there was a KGB plot to shoot the Pope. The chronology begins December 13th with Brzezinski working with the National Security Iranian Task Force, meeting Ibrahim Yadsi in Washington, D.C., making arrangements to topple the Shah of Iran. That was December 13th, 1978. The next date they have is 1979. Secret clauses of the Camp David Accord signed by Jimmy Carter, Egypt's Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin. This is the time when Mr. Secord and Van Marbod and Thomas Cline were setting up offices in Switzerland, where the money that would come as a result of weapons and weapons deals at the Camp David Accord would be diverted to the PLO and to Iran. The next day, January the 3rd and 4th, 1979, Zbigniew Brzezinski and NATO commander Alexander Haig, who soon to become the Secretary of State in 1981 under Reagan. He was commander of NATO. He met with Air Force General Robert Husner in Iran with orders to prevent the Shah's Imperial Armed Forces from suppressing the fundamentalist uprising. February the 1st, 1979, Khomeini flies to Tehran from Paris and establishes his dual government, along with Prime Minister Yadsi as foreign minister and Minur Bazargan as the prime minister, rather than Yadsi as foreign minister. And this chronology goes into November 4th and 5th. The 1979, the Americans taken hostage. December the 12th, 1979, Carter orders the expulsion of the Iranian diplomats. December 19th, 1979, a military attaché interested in Iranian projects in Washington was discovered working in our Office of Navy Intelligence, the top Iranian, working with Zbigniew Brzezinski and Navy Intelligence. In the summer of 1980, they were working with Senator Robert McFarlane, a staffer of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and they were meeting with Reagan campaign official Richard Allen. He helped form the Georgetown Center with Mr. Abshire, and they were making a deal whereby the hostages would not be released to Jimmy Carter before the 1980 election. The chronology goes on July 22nd, 1980. The head of the anti-Khomeini Iran Freedom Foundation, Ali Tabatabai, was assassinated by an American recruited by the Iranian government. This is where the Bernard Fensterwald case comes into, in the murder of Tabatabai in Washington, D.C., and how the Justice Department, Mr. Trott, and the people investigating the Iranian story, or should be, were involved in protecting the people who murdered an anti-Khomeini person in the United States, protecting those people that were pro-Khomeini. August 1980, Nahadian, working under Cyrus Hashemi, headed the first Gulf Bank and Trust Company in New York, and that money came from Switzerland, as I say, from Merrill Lynch, from Don Reagan, the Secretary, Chief of Staff right now for the President, rather. September 1980, Brzezinski orders 130 airlifts of arms and spare parts to Iran as part of a secret NATO supply base was used. August 26, 1980, an attorney for Cyrus Hashemi threatens a lawsuit unless his links to as being head of the Savama tied to Khomeini and terrorism should discontinue. And Hashemi, ironically, was killed in July of this year. and he was threatening suits if people linked him to anti-Khomeini murders in the United States, and then he himself was murdered. September 25, 1980, General Mordecai Hod, former chief of the Israeli Air Force, calls for Ma'ariv, an Israeli initiative, to start arming Iran. And September 27, 1980, Israeli Deputy Defense Mordecai Zipori says Israel is prepared to give Iran logistical support. They continued to do it. December 1980, Morris Amitay, head of the Israeli lobbying group, to sound out incoming Reagan administration on continuing the Israeli arms sales to Iran, which they did. And then in 1985, Ronald Reagan, with his full approval, took over the continuation of sales. In 1980, when Alexander Haig was Secretary of State, there were negotiations called a Memorandum of Understanding on U.S.-Israeli strategic cooperations. It suspended when Israel annexed the Golan Heights. Michael LEDEEN was an aide to Secretary of State Haig and played a key role in a series of Haig-Sharon meetings before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. In 1982, he also played a key role in Grenada with Mr. Robert Brown from Soldier of Fortune, Mr. Singlaub's magazine. These meetings finalized a massive increase in U.S. intelligence flow to Israel, and the agreements were known as the Mirador Protocols. This is Michael LEDEEN and Israel and Mr. Sharon, and they went into arms smuggling and arming Iran from these early dates. Time is running out. I will continue and update this until the final date on this is March 8th, 1982, when the United States, New York Times reports 1 to 2 million in parts and weapons were sent to Iran. And, of course, there were arrests for that. And Mr. Cyrus Hashemi, Israeli General Avram Baram, and 17 others were charged with $2.5 billion. My time is out, and I have like 100 times more what I could put on in 1 hour, but we have to settle for what we have here. This is Mae Brussell. I'll continue with some of these horrendous scandals about the in players, the out players, who's going out and who's staying tight. This is the Iran scandal. The president is out, according to Robert Novak. The presidency is dead, so now watch the feathers fly. As I said, this is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week